The moment G. Bush walked into that conversation, the entire dynamic shifted. This was not a typical back-and-forth sports debate where two sides exchange opinions and move on. What happened in that room was something far more significant: a live, public dismantling of a media narrative that had been building around Shedeur Sanders for months. The Cleveland media had been running a particular story, repeating specific talking points with a level of certainty that had no business existing given the evidence available. And when G. Bush decided to engage, he did not come in loud or emotional. He came in composed, prepared, and armed with specifics, and that is exactly what made it so devastating for the people on the other side of the table. Jason Lloyd and portions of the Cleveland media had not simply been questioning Shedeur Sanders' performance. The coverage went well past standard football analysis. The narrative being pushed suggested that Shedeur could not read a defense, did not study film, lacked football intelligence, and fundamentally did not belong in the league. These were not measured assessments with supporting film breakdowns or statistical context. These were absolute conclusions being delivered with full confidence based on a handful of games, a sample size so limited that drawing permanent judgments from it is not analysis, it is narrative construction. Judging a quarterback's entire ceiling after 6 games in a limited role is like reviewing a full film based only on the trailer. You are not engaging with the complete picture. You are reacting to a curated fragment, and then presenting that reaction as expertise. Real football analysis leaves room for development. It acknowledges the conditions a player is operating in. It factors in the quality of supporting infrastructure, offensive line play, scheme fit, coaching stability, and the number of representatives a player is actually receiving in practice. When a media voice speaks in absolutes about a young quarterback this early in his career, that is not a sign of analytical depth. That is a red flag. And the level of certainty in the coverage of Shedeur Sanders had long since crossed that line from football critique into something that sounded far more personal and deliberate. That is the environment G. Bush stepped into. And from the moment he began speaking, it was clear this was not going to be a conversation the other side could manage the way they had been managing the narrative on their own platforms. G. Bush did not raise his voice. He did not reach for drama. He simply started making his points with specificity and logic, and that alone was enough to expose how thin the foundation of the opposing argument actually was. He immediately highlighted how unusual it is to speak with absolute certainty about a quarterback who has not been given a full, fair opportunity to operate within a functioning system. He challenged the logic of drawing permanent conclusions from a small sample size. And then he did something that stopped the conversation cold. He went through the quarterback comparison list name by name. Kyler Murray, Anthony Richardson, Malik Willis, Dante Moore, Cade Klubnik, Geno Smith. Every name that had been floated as real competition for the Cleveland starting quarterback position got addressed directly. And the answer was the same across the board: none of those names were coming, none of them represented actual competition, and the entire crowded QB rumor narrative that had been circulating was built on nothing. Once G. Bush said it plainly and walked through it systematically, the narrative did not just weaken. It collapsed. But what happened next was arguably more revealing than anything G. Bush actually said. Because as soon as he started building his argument, the interruptions began. He was cut off repeatedly while trying to make his points. He was given 36 seconds to speak during stretches where Tyus Powell was allowed multiple uninterrupted minutes. G. Bush pointed this out directly and calmly, and that observation alone told you everything you needed to know about how that conversation was actually being managed. 36 seconds versus several minutes is not a debate format. That is a suppression attempt. When one side is being consistently cut off in the middle of making a factual argument while the other side is allowed to speak freely, that is not a balanced discussion, that is a controlled environment designed to limit what information actually reaches the audience. And the audience noticed. What made it even more telling was Tyus Powell's aggressive defense of Jason Lloyd, who was not even present in the room. Powell jumped in hard to protect a take that was not there to defend itself. In a legitimate debate, if the argument is solid, it does not need that level of external protection. You engage with the counter-argument, you present your evidence, and you let the logic do the work. Going that hard to shield a take from scrutiny, especially when the person who made the take is not even in the room, signals something very different. It signals that the people in that room understood what would happen if G. Bush was allowed to finish his points uninterrupted. There is a fundamental difference between healthy debate and echo chamber behavior. In a genuine debate, both sides are allowed to speak. Points get engaged with directly. If the evidence does not support your position, you adjust. What was on display in that conversation was the opposite of that. It was a closed circle doing everything it could to protect itself from a challenge it was not prepared to absorb. And the more aggressively the interruptions came, the more clearly that dynamic became visible to everyone watching. Now here is where the story becomes even more important, because the media narrative about Shedeur Sanders did not exist in isolation. It was directly connected to decisions that were being made inside the Cleveland Browns organization during the 2024 season. Shedeur was not being given equal representatives during practice. He was placed on a separate field while other quarterbacks were integrated into the offense. The separation was not a reflection of his ability. It was a structural decision that controlled how much exposure he got to the starting offense, which directly limited how much he could demonstrate his command of the playbook in a real team setting. There is a massive difference between a player falling behind due to lack of preparation and a player not being given the opportunity to show what they have already prepared. Shedeur Sanders was in the second category. He was not failing to learn the system. He was being systematically limited in how much access he had to apply what he was learning. And then, once those conditions were in place, the media narrative followed, using that limited exposure as evidence that Shedeur was not ready. That framing is not a fair evaluation. That is a setup with a pre-written conclusion. Dillon Gabriel receiving representatives with the second team, and at times with the first team, was not the result of him outperforming Shedeur Sanders in a fair competition. It was the result of him being positioned to receive those representatives, and even with that structural advantage, there was no performance from Gabriel that was so dominant it forced a legitimate conversation about the depth chart. The gap in the room was visible. It was just not being acknowledged honestly in the coverage coming out of Cleveland. You cannot limit a player's representatives throughout the week, restrict his integration into the first-team offense, and then turn around and critique his stat line as evidence that he is not developing fast enough. That is not analysis. That is manufacturing a conclusion and then pointing to the conditions you created as the proof. Once you understand how the practice structure was set up during that period, the media narrative about Shedeur not being ready does not just look questionable, it looks coordinated. And coordination is exactly the right word for what G. Bush was describing. When multiple media voices use the same language, push the same conclusions, and then defend those conclusions aggressively even when confronted with direct counter-evidence, that is not independent analysis happening to land in the same place. That is a shared narrative being protected. G. Bush identified that pattern clearly and called it out without flinching. He did not speculate about motivation. He just described what was visible, the same talking points, the same certainty, the same defensive posture when challenged, and let the audience draw their own conclusion. The rotating spotlight treatment is not unique to Shedeur Sanders either. The Cleveland media ran the same cycle with Kenny Pickett. He was built up, given the full hype treatment, and then discarded the moment things did not instantly click, with no real breakdown of what went wrong or what conditions he was operating in. Dillon Gabriel got the same thing. Full promotion one week, silence the next. This pattern repeats because it is not driven by genuine evaluation. It is driven by the reality that debate generates clicks, drama generates engagement, and confusion keeps an audience in a constant state of reaction. The media does not need to be right. It just needs to be loud and consistent enough that the take starts sounding like fact through sheer repetition. Strip away all of it, the rotating names, the recycled talking points, the coordinated certainty, the interrupted debate, and what you are left with is straightforward. Shedeur Sanders is the starter. That was never genuinely in question. The competition that was being framed as real was, name by name, not real. Even operating in a system that limited his representatives and controlled his exposure, Shedeur showed composure, decision-making ability, and a command of the game that was visible to anyone watching without a predetermined conclusion in mind. He was producing in limited situations that were not set up for him to succeed, which actually makes what he showed more significant, not less. G. Bush did not just defend one player in one conversation. He demonstrated, in real time, how a media narrative gets constructed and protected, how repetition creates the appearance of consensus, how interruption limits the reach of counter-evidence, and how structural decisions inside an organization can be repackaged as player failure. That is information that extends well beyond Shedeur Sanders and Cleveland. It is a framework for understanding how football coverage can drift from analysis into agenda. Fans who watch that conversation come away with something concrete. They have the quarterback list that was broken down name by name. They have the 36-second statistic sitting next to several minutes of uninterrupted time. They have the practice structure context that reframes the entire development narrative. And they have a clear picture of where Shedeur Sanders actually stands going into this season, which is ahead, prepared, and already demonstrating what he is capable of in situations that were not designed to make him look good. The curtain is pulled back. The mystery around the Cleveland quarterback situation is gone. Every take moving forward about Shedeur Sanders needs to be held to the standard G. Bush applied in that room: show the footage, identify the source of the claim, account for the conditions the player is actually operating in, and leave room for the player to prove himself in a fair environment. That is the baseline. Anything below that is not analysis. It is noise. If this breakdown gave you the full picture that the coverage was leaving out, hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Shedeur Sanders' story in Cleveland is just getting started, and we are going to cover every step of it with the same standard that was set in that room.